Hello again. So here we are, it's part two. We've already talked about the reasons why Jesus has been arrested, and we talked about that Last Supper that he has with his apostles and his loved ones. And now we have the actual moment where Jesus is going to be arrested. So the council of elders meet, the chief priests and the scribes, they get together and they talk about all of the reasons that we talked about earlier, about Jesus, violating the Hebrew law of keeping holy the Sabbath, etc. And they decide that, yeah, Jesus is a troublemaker. He's not shutting up. The only way to get rid of him and his followers is to basically crucify him, to put him to death. But in order to do that, the Jewish people obviously don't have they don't put people to death. It's the government that has to do that. But first they have to bring Jesus in front of the Jewish council, the Supreme Council, and that's called the Sanhedrin, Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin. So that's happening in the background. Meanwhile, Judas has gone to the chief priests and elders, and he's made a deal with them to betray Jesus. Jesus is still in that Garden of Gethsemane with his three closest friends, the agony in the garden. And what do you know? Judas comes up and he tells the priests and the scribes that the one I kiss is the one. They don't know for sure which one is Jesus. They need to know for sure. And so Judas goes over and betrays Jesus with a kiss. Later we hear in one of the Gospels that Judas is going to go and commit suicide when he realizes what he's done. But for right now, he goes and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. So Jesus is arrested, and then he's brought in front of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Jewish Council, and they're basically a governing body, which means they supervise the rules and they supervise the teaching. So it's a governing and a religious council. I don't know that it's I don't know if this is the wrong analogy to make, but you know how our magisterium is the teaching arm of the church. It's the governing arm of the church. Perhaps it might be a little bit similar to that. But anyway, so the Sanhedrin is the religious council for the Jewish faith. They have the teachers. They include teachers who are responsible for the teaching of the law, and it's a governing body that they enforce the law. They agree that Jesus is guilty of blasphemy, and then now they're going to send him to the governor to put him to a secular death, because again, they don't put people to death. So they bring crucifixion is only done by Roman law, so they bring Jesus before the governor, who is Pontius Pilate. We've heard about Pontius Pilate, even in the Nicene Creed. Pilate listens to their complaints and doesn't really understand. He's not Jewish, so he doesn't really care about blasphemy. He just wants to know, what's this guy done, and all they can do is tell him that he's violated Jewish law. And the governor Pilate, he doesn't really care about that, and he doesn't really think. He says, I find no guilt in him. It's interesting from Luke's gospel that it includes Jesus being brought in front of Herod. You'll remember that Luke is writing for the Gentiles. He's writing from more a secular point of view. He's writing more for the Romans and people who are not of faith. And it's interesting that Luke includes Jesus being brought in front of Herod. Maybe Luke has some information about that the other gospel writers don't have. Remember, Luke is the one that wrote to Theophilus. He's kind of what I was calling like an investigator, so to speak. And maybe he has other information than the other gospel writers, or it might just be that the other gospel writers are not concerned about secular issues, whereas Luke is. So regardless, in Luke's gospel, Pilate realizes that Jesus is from Galilee, and therefore he's under the jurisdiction of Herod. And Herod is in town that day. And so Jesus sends Jesus to Herod, who happens to be in Jerusalem, to say, well, this guy Jesus, he's from Galilee. He's not my problem. I'm going to send him to Herod and have Herod decide. Herod is happy to meet Jesus because he's heard about him performing miracles, and he kind of almost like wants to be entertained by Jesus. They bring him before Herod. Jesus doesn't give him any answers. So I guess Herod is bored enough. His wife kind of tells him, be careful. She's very superstitious about hurting this man of God. But nevertheless, Herod just has Jesus mocked, and he sends him back to Pilate. And so in all of the Gospels by now, Jesus has been made fun of because he's what the Sanhedrin are saying is that he's been calling himself the King of the Jews, that he is God. And so they dress him up like a king. They put a crown of thorns on his head, which we'll talk in another video about really what the crown was. It wasn't a round wreath. It was more of like a skull cap almost. And they make fun of him, and they spit on him, and they harass him. So that's happening, but then they also bring Jesus to a scourging. Now, this is partly because Pilate, in a way, people who normally would be crucified would not be so severely scourged, because crucifixion is really not just meant to be a form of execution. It's really a form of torture. And if you're scourged and you're so beaten that you're going to die quickly, it kind of defeats the purpose of being crucified. So we kind of think that maybe Pilate, one of the reasons why he has him scourged so severely is that he's kind of hoping that the Jewish people are going to be happy with just that, and they're not going to follow through on the crucifixion, because again, Pilate doesn't really see anything that he's done anything wrong. Pilate, in fact, knows that it's Passover for the Jewish people, and he knows that there's a tradition for the Passover to release an imprisoned person, to release a criminal, not a criminal, but release someone who has been put in jail. And normally the people would call for somebody who they think has been unjustly jailed. Pilate, though, figures, well, there's this bad guy, notorious killer and rebel named Barabbas. He says to the people, he figures, you know what, well, I'll offer to release Barabbas, because there's no way they're going to want to have Barabbas released instead of Jesus. So he makes makes a deal, and he says, all right, well, listen, I'll give you a choice. You can either release Jesus or you can release Barabbas. And wouldn't you know that the crowd has been riled up so much by the scribes and the chief priests that they yell to release Barabbas and to crucify Jesus. Now Pilate sees that the people really are, going crazy, right? And he is afraid now. He's in Jerusalem. Herod is around, and he does not want to have the people, create a scene, have a riot. And so he decides, you know what? I don't really care. I'm just going to satisfy the crowd. And so again, Pilate still doesn't really see Jesus as guilty. So what he does is he symbolically, he takes a bowl and he washes his hand, and he says, I'm washing myself of the guilt of crucifying this man, Jesus. Because again, basically, he doesn't really see the point in crucifying Jesus. And then so Jesus is brought away and he is crucified. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about what that actually meant, what the crucifixion actually meant. Okay, so next we have that Jesus is actually crucified. And without getting, I guess, part of me wants to get gory so that you understand just how horrible it was. The other part, of course, wants me to be respectful, but I'm just going to give you a few basics. There's two great websites out there that can give you a little bit more on the medical and the political, the historical aspect of the crucifixion. One is called Catholic Insight. It's the physical effects of scourging and crucifixion. That's the one mainly that I'm taking a lot of this information from, although there's other really great books out there. The first book that was really written about this was called The Doctor at Calvary, and it really questioned and looked at the physicality of Jesus being crucified, because when we see the picture of Jesus hanging on the cross, it's not really that accurate, and so you'll understand why. So first, we remember that Pilate had Jesus scourged, which is basically a whipping. The whip was an item that was called a flagrum, and so the actual scourging was actually called a flagellation. It included 3 or more leather straps, and it had metal balls at the end to weigh it down to make it, heavier, and pieces of bone that would basically tear into the skin. And so because of the weight of the bones, the ends of the whip, the ends of the flagrum would go around into the front of the body as well, and not just slash the skin, but actually gash it. The pieces of bone acted almost like fish hooks that would tear at the skin and the muscle. And so there would have been a lot of internal bruising as well with the lungs and the ribs. There's an animated kind of video about the scourging, how powerful it was. For Jesus, the Jewish people would have scourged him 39 times, really 40, but they're always afraid of going over, so they would whip them 39 times. This is unusual to be done right before crucifixion, but we remember that Pilate is partly having Jesus whipped because he's trying to avoid having him crucified. So the soldiers, meanwhile, are also mocking him. They give him a crown of thorns. This isn't what we see on the cross, like a wreath, but it would be more like a skull cap, and it would affect two main nerves going down the front and the back of the head. But the front nerves especially would put any kind of pressure on the face, would be excruciating pain. Any kind of breeze or wind would hurt. And so we remember that the soldiers are meanwhile mocking and slapping and spitting at Jesus. So he's made to carry the crossbeam, which is actually, the cross would be in two parts. The main part, the post, would already be there at the hill. That was called the stipes. And then the crossbeam would be placed on Jesus's back, which remember now is all very bloody. We know that on the walk to the stipes that he fell a few times due to the weight of the cross. And you can just imagine this big beam falling down upon his back. Jesus becomes increasingly weak, and so they engage a man, Simon of Cyrene, to come and help him carry the cross the rest of the way. The crucifix, the cross, the stipes would already be placed up in full view of the people of Jerusalem because they want people to see. This is what's the result of being a criminal. And so it was at a hilly area called Calvary, or a Golgotha, which means the place of the skull because the area is shaped like a skull. Again, the stipes is already there. Perhaps it might have even been a trunk of a tree that was already there. But it has a notch, kind of like a Lincoln log at the top of it. It's probably 7 or 8 feet tall, and there's a notch there where the crossbeam is going to be placed into that notch. It's low enough that when somebody is dead, if the body hasn't been removed, that animals would devour the body. So Jesus is thrown on his back. He's nailed through the hands, through the wrists, causing incredible pain in his wrist bone. Anybody that's had any kind of carpal tunnel surgery may know about that. Terrible radiating pain. It's actually in the wrist between those two bones that would keep the body secure up on the cross. Jesus is then lifted up onto the stipes, and then his feet are nailed to the cross. Hanging on the cross would basically be constant stretching to catch his breath, and then hanging out of weakness, standing to catch his breath again, and then hanging out of weakness. So Jesus dies in a very few hours, probably because of the great amount of blood that he's lost. And remember that it's, again, unusual to be so beaten before crucifixion, but Jesus has been treated very harshly and differently than anybody else. His cause of death would have been heart attack, blood loss, but probably also very likely the asphyxiation, the suffocation of his lungs, of having to stretch his body to breathe, and then having to hang there to collapse, to die. They usually put a sign above a criminal's head accusing them of their crime. Pilate says to put above Jesus's head. He doesn't understand what blasphemy is, so he says, put above his head that he's King of the Jews. This is ironic because we do believe that he is our King, he is our Messiah,